On the morning of October 23, 1941, the Soviet battleship Marat sat at anchor in Kronstadt harbor near Leningrad, her massive guns firing in support of Soviet defenders, struggling to hold back the German siege. The Marat was a symbol of Soviet naval power, a veteran battleship that had served in the Russian Imperial Navy during World War I. And had been modernized and recommissioned into the Soviet fleet. She displaced over 23,000 tons, mounted 12 12-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, was protected by heavy armored, designed to withstand hits from enemy battleship guns, and represented a formidable concentration of naval firepower. Soviet commanders believed she was safe in Kronstadt, protected by the harbor's defenses, by anti-aircraft batteries that ringed the naval base, and by the simple fact that battleships were not supposed to be vulnerable to aircraft, especially not to the relatively small bombs that dive bombers could carry. Then, shortly after 11 a.m., a formation of German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers screamed down through the defensive fire, and one pilot, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, flying a specially modified Stuka carrying a single 2,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, scored a direct hit that penetrated the Marat's armored deck, detonated in the forward magazine, and tore the ship apart in a catastrophic explosion that sent a mushroom cloud thousands of feet into the air and broke the battleship's back. This singular achievement, one pilot, in one dive bomber sinking a battleship with a single bomb, represented both a technical and tactical triumph that demonstrated how air power had fundamentally changed naval warfare and how even the mightiest surface ships were vulnerable to attack from above. To understand the significance of what occurred on October 23, 1941, and why the sinking of the Marat was such a remarkable achievement, we must first examine the context in which this attack took place, the technology and tactics that made it possible, and the broader evolution of the relationship between air power and sea power that had been unfolding since aircraft first appeared in military service. The Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber that Rudel flew that day was one of the most distinctive and psychologically intimidating aircraft of World War II, yet it was also, in many ways, an obsolete design by 1941 standards, slow, vulnerable to modern fighters, and capable of carrying only modest bomb loads compared to other bombers. The fact that such an aircraft could destroy a battleship seemed to contradict everything naval theorists had believed about the balance between air power and sea power. Yet the sinking of the Marat was not an isolated incident, but rather a dramatic illustration of principles that forward-thinking air power advocates had been arguing for 2 decades. The Junkers Ju-87, universally known by its nickname Stuka, a contraction of Sturzkampfflugzeug, meaning dive bomber in German, had been designed in the mid-1930s as a precision ground attack aircraft capable of delivering bombs with extraordinary accuracy against point targets, including bridges, buildings, fortifications, and vehicles. The aircraft's design embodied the dive bombing concept taken to its logical extreme. The Stuka featured inverted gull wings that provided ground clearance for the fixed landing gear while keeping the gear legs short and strong, dive brakes that could be deployed to control airspeed during near-vertical dives, an automatic pull-out system that would recover the aircraft from its dive, even if the pilot blacked out from G-forces, sirens mounted on the landing gear that produced a terrifying wail during dives and served both to demoralize enemies and to signal to German ground forces that air support was arriving, and a specialized bomb sight that allowed the pilot to aim while diving nearly straight down at the target. The Stuka had gained fame and infamy during the early years of World War II. Particularly during the invasions of Poland, France, where it served as flying artillery for German ground forces, destroying enemy positions, breaking up counterattacks, and spreading terror among troops who found themselves subjected to screaming dives and precision bombing. The psychological impact of Stuka attacks was as important as the physical destruction they caused. The distinctive siren wail, The sight of aircraft diving almost vertically toward their targets and the precision with which Stukas could place bombs created a terror that was out of proportion to the actual casualties inflicted. Enemy troops learned to dread the appearance of Stukas, and in Poland and France, that dread sometimes caused units to break and run even before bombs fell. However, the Stuka's successes in Poland and France had been achieved against opponents who lacked effective fighter cover and modern air defenses. When the Luftwaffe committed Stukas to the Battle of Britain in summer 1940, the results were catastrophic. British fighters, particularly Spitfires and Hurricanes, found the Stuka to be an easy target. The Stuka's maximum speed was only about 240 miles per hour, slower than most contemporary fighters by 100 miles per hour or more. It was not maneuverable in the way fighters were, could not engage in dogfighting, and its defensive armament of 2 or 3 machine guns was inadequate against determined fighter attack. Stukas were shot down in large numbers over Britain, and the Luftwaffe was forced to withdraw them from the battle after suffering unsustainable losses. The experience seemed to confirm that the Stuka was obsolete, a vulnerability that could not survive in airspace where enemy fighters operated. Yet the Stuka continued to serve on the Eastern Front after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, and there it proved effective once again because Soviet fighters were less numerous, less capable, and less able to maintain constant air superiority than the RAF had been over Britain. Initial months of Operation Barbarossa, Stukas destroyed thousands of Soviet vehicles, fortifications, and troop concentrations, supporting the rapid German advance that captured vast territories and enormous numbers of Soviet prisoners. The Stuka units developed specialized tactics and learned to operate in environments where enemy fighters were present, but not dominant, using their own fighter escorts for protection, attacking in massed formations to overwhelm defenses, and exploiting their precision bombing capability to destroy targets that conventional level bombers could not reliably hit. By October 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city and a major industrial and cultural center. The Germans had encircled the city and had begun a siege that would last nearly 900 days and would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians through starvation, disease, and bombardment. However, the Germans had not captured Kronstadt, the naval fortress and harbor located on Kotlin Island in the Gulf of Finland, just west of Leningrad. Kronstadt was home to the Soviet Baltic Fleet, and the ships based there, including the Battleship Marat and her sister ship Okeryabskaya Revolutsiya, were using their heavy guns to fire in support of the defenders of Leningrad, lobbing 12-inch shells at German positions, breaking up attacks, and generally making themselves a serious problem for the German forces conducting the siege. The Marat herself was a veteran ship with a remarkable history. She had been laid down in 1911 as the Petropavlovsk, one of the Russian Imperial Navy's Gungut-class battleships. She had served in World War I, had survived the Russian Revolution and the chaos that followed, had been renamed Marat in 1921 after the French revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat, and had been modernized in the 1930s with upgraded fire control systems, enhanced anti-aircraft armament, and improved armor protection. By 1941, she was not a modern battleship by international standards. Newer battleships being built by the United States, Britain, Germany, and Japan were larger, faster, more heavily armed, and better protected. However, the Marat was still a powerful warship, and her 12-inch guns gave her the ability to strike targets up to 20 miles away with devastating effect. For German troops besieging Leningrad, the Marat was a constant threat, a source of heavy fire support that could break up attacks and destroy positions with impunity because German artillery could not reach Kronstadt to strike back. German commanders recognized that neutralizing the Soviet Baltic Fleet, and particularly the battleships, would significantly ease the siege of Leningrad, and would eliminate a source of heavy fire support that was making German operations more difficult and costly. However, Kronstadt was heavily defended. The harbor was protected by extensive anti-aircraft batteries, by naval guns that could engage surface targets, by mines and coastal defenses, and by the simple fact that it was an island fortress that could not easily be approached or assaulted. Direct naval attack was impossible because the German Kriegsmarine had no heavy ships in the Baltic that could challenge Soviet battleships. Artillery bombardment was impossible because Kronstadt was beyond the range of German heavy artillery. The only option was air attack. But attacking heavily defended warships with bombs had historically been difficult and often ineffective. The challenge of sinking warships with bombs, particularly heavily armored warships like battleships, was one that had occupied the attention of airpower theorists and naval officers for decades. In the interwar period, advocates of airpower like the American Billy Mitchell and the Italian Giulio Douhet had argued that aircraft had made battleships obsolete, that bombers could sink any surface ship, and that nations investing in expensive battleships were wasting resources on weapons that were vulnerable to relatively cheap aircraft. Naval officers had generally rejected these claims, pointing out that battleships were heavily armored, specifically to resist damage, that anti-aircraft defenses would make bombing attacks prohibitively costly, and that the relatively small bombs that aircraft could carry would not be sufficient to sink heavily. Both sides had some validity to their arguments. Early attempts to sink warships with bombs had produced mixed results. In demonstrations and exercises, aircraft had sunk obsolete battleships, but these were typically stationary targets without crews to conduct damage control and without anti-aircraft defenses firing back. In actual combat, aircraft had sunk smaller warships like cruisers and destroyers, but these ships had thinner armor and were more vulnerable to damage. Sinking a battleship with its heavy armor protection, its compartmentalized design that could contain flooding, and its professional crew trained in damage control was a much more difficult proposition. Moreover, battleships were typically protected by anti-aircraft guns, by escort vessels, and increasingly by fighter cover, making attacks dangerous and often resulting in heavy losses among attacking aircraft. The problem was partly technical and partly technical. Technically, the challenge was delivering a bomb powerful enough to penetrate battleship armor and cause catastrophic damage. Most bombs carried by aircraft in the 1930s and early 1940s were general-purpose bombs designed to explode on contact, or after slight delay, creating blast and fragmentation damage effective against unarmored targets, but relatively ineffective against heavy armor. These bombs would explode on a battleship's armored deck or superstructure, causing surface damage, killing exposed crew members, damaging unarmored equipment, but not penetrating into the ship's vitals to cause catastrophic flooding or ammunition explosions. Reliably, an aircraft needed to deliver an armor-piercing bomb, a weapon specifically designed to penetrate heavy armor before detonating inside the ship where it could cause maximum damage. Armor-piercing bombs were difficult to design and manufacture. They needed to be extremely strong to withstand the impact with armored steel, without breaking apart. They needed to be heavy to have sufficient momentum to penetrate thick armor. They needed to have a delayed fuse that would not detonate until the bomb had penetrated through the armor and entered the ship's interior. And they needed to be carried by an aircraft, which meant there were limits to how large and heavy they could be. Most dive bombers like the Stuka normally carried bombs weighing 500 to 1,000 pounds. These bombs were effective against many targets, but were marginal against battleship armor. A 500-pound general-purpose bomb might damage a battleship's superstructure or disable guns, but it was unlikely to sink the ship. A 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb might penetrate thinner armor, but battleship main armor belts and deck armor were designed to resist much heavier shells. The Germans had developed a special 2,000-pound armor-piercing bomb designated the SC-2000 specifically for use against heavily armored targets, including warships and fortifications. This bomb was at the absolute limit of what a Stuka could carry, requiring modifications to the aircraft including reinforced mounting points and specialized release mechanisms. Only specially modified Stukas, flown by the most experienced pilots, could carry this weapon, and using it required exceptional skill because the additional weight affected the aircraft's handling and performance, particularly during the critical dive and pull-out phases. Hans-Ulrich Rudel was one of the pilots selected to fly these specially modified Stukas, carrying the 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs against the Soviet Baltic Fleet. Rudel was already an experienced Stuka pilot by October 1941, having flown numerous combat missions since the invasion of the Soviet Union began. He would go on to become the most decorated German serviceman of World War II and the most successful ground attack pilot in history, credited with destroying over 500 tanks, numerous ships, hundreds of other vehicles and fortifications, and flying over 2,500 combat missions. However, in October 1941, while experienced and skilled, he had not yet achieved the legendary status he would later attain. He was simply one of the best Stuka pilots available for an exceptionally difficult and important mission. The mission to attack the Soviet battleships at Kronstadt was planned carefully. Intelligence had provided information on the ships' locations, on the defenses surrounding Kronstadt, on the approaches that offered the best chance of surprise, and the clearest routes to the targets. The attack would be conducted by multiple Stukas, some carrying the special 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, and others carrying conventional bombs to suppress defenses and attack secondary targets. Fighter escorts would provide protection against Soviet fighters. The timing would be chosen to maximize chances of surprise and to take advantage of weather conditions that would provide some concealment during the approach. On the morning of October 23, 1941, Rudel and his fellow Stuka pilots took off and flew toward Kronstadt. The flight took them over German-held territory and then out over the Gulf of Finland toward Kotlin Island. As they approached, Soviet anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with bursting shells and streams of tracer fire. The Stukas pushed through the defensive fire, accepting losses and damage, focused on reaching their targets. Rudel identified the Marat through the smoke and haze, a massive gray shape sitting at anchor, her guns silent at that moment, her anti-aircraft weapons firing upward at the attacking aircraft. Rudel rolled his Stuka into its characteristic near-vertical dive, the sirens wailing, the wind screaming past the canopy, the altimeter unwinding rapidly as the aircraft plunged toward the battleship. The 2,000-pound bomb hung beneath the fuselage, its massive weight requiring all of Rudel's skill to control the aircraft's dive. Through his bomb sight, Rudel kept the Marat centered, making minute corrections to his dive angle to account for wind, for the aircraft's movement, for the dozens of variables that determined where the bomb would strike. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as the Marat's gunners concentrated their fire on the diving Stukas. Tracers reaching up toward the aircraft, shells bursting close enough to rock the aircraft with their blast. At the release point, probably around 2,000 to 3,000 feet altitude, Rudel pressed the bomb release. The 2,000-pound armor-piercing bomb separated from the aircraft, and Rudel immediately hauled back on the control stick, pulling the Stuka out of its dive, the joyed forces crushing down on him and his rear gunner, the wings straining under the stress, the automatic pull-out system helping to recover the aircraft from the nearly vertical dive as the Stuka pulled up and away. Rudel and his gunner watched the bomb fall toward the Marat, a dark shape plummeting toward the battleship's foredeck. The bomb struck the Marat's armored deck forward of the first main gun turret. The impact must have been visible from miles away, a brilliant flash, and a gout of smoke and debris. The armor-piercing bomb, designed specifically for this purpose, smashed through the armored deck that was designed to resist hits from enemy battleship shells. It penetrated into the ship's interior, its delayed fuse counting down the microseconds, and then detonated inside the forward magazine, where hundreds of tons of propellant charges and shells for the battleship's 12-inch guns were stored. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire forward section of the battleship erupted in a massive blast that sent a mushroom cloud thousands of feet into the air, visible from both Leningrad and from German positions miles away. The blast wave shattered windows in Kronstadt and was felt across the harbor. When the smoke cleared, the Marat's entire bow had been blown off. The forward turret had disappeared, either blown overboard or buried in the wreckage. The ship was broken, her back snapped, her bow section settling onto the harbor bottom, while the stern section remained afloat but heavily damaged. Hundreds of crew members were killed instantly in the explosion, or died in the fires that followed. The Marat would never sail again. For Rudel and the other Stuka pilots, the sight of the massive explosion confirmed that they had achieved what they had been sent to do. They had sunk a battleship with dive bombers, something that naval theorists had debated for decades, and that many had claimed was impossible, or at least improbable. The achievement demonstrated several important principles about air power, about naval warfare, and about the vulnerability of even the largest warships to attack from above. First, it demonstrated that with the right weapon, the right delivery system, and the right level of skill, aircraft could indeed destroy heavily armored warships. The key was the armor-piercing bomb, specifically designed to penetrate heavy armor. Combined with the precision delivery that dive bombing offered, a level bomber dropping bombs from high altitude had little chance of hitting a specific ship, and even if it did hit, general-purpose bombs would likely cause only surface damage. But a dive bomber could place a bomb precisely on target, and if that bomb was an armor-piercing weapon, it could penetrate deck armor and detonate inside the ship, where even modest explosive force could cause catastrophic damage if it reached magazines or machinery spaces. Second, it demonstrated that battleships at anchor or in harbor were particularly vulnerable to air attack. Ships at sea could maneuver, making them harder targets. They could increase speed, change course, and generally make bomb delivery more difficult. Ships at anchor were stationary targets that could be attacked with maximum precision. This vulnerability had implications for how navies deployed their capital ships, forcing them to consider whether harbors were safe havens or potential traps where ships could be destroyed by air attack. Third, it demonstrated that the relationship between air power and sea power had fundamentally changed. For centuries, the battleship had been the ultimate expression of naval power, the weapon that controlled the seas and that determined the outcome of naval conflicts. Aircraft carriers were beginning to challenge battleships for dominance, but in 1941, this transition was still underway, and its outcome was not yet certain. The sinking of the Marat was one more data point in a growing body of evidence that suggested aircraft, whether operating from carriers or from land bases, had become the dominant factor in naval warfare, and that surface ships, even the mightiest battleships, were vulnerable to attack from above in ways that fundamentally altered naval strategy and tactics. The Soviet response to the sinking of the Marat was to claim that the ship had not been sunk but only damaged, that she remained operational, and that her guns continued to fire in support of Leningrad's defense. There was some truth to this propaganda. While the Marat's forward section had been destroyed and the ship would never sail again, the after section remained afloat and was eventually grounded deliberately to prevent complete sinking. The surviving gun turrets were kept operational, and the Marat, or what remained of her, did continue to serve as a stationary gun battery, firing in support of Soviet defenders. After the war, the Marat was surveyed and it was determined that repairs were not feasible. The forward section was scrapped, and the bow stern section was eventually refloated and towed away for disposal. For Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the sinking of the Marat was the first of many remarkable achievements in a career that would make him one of the most effective and most decorated combat pilots of any nation in World War II. He would continue flying Stukas throughout the war, transitioning later to the F-190 fighter bomber, but maintaining his role as a ground attack and anti-shipping specialist. His total of over 2,500 combat missions is unmatched by any other pilot, and his record of destroyed targets, including over 500 tanks, demonstrates both extraordinary skill and extraordinary luck in surviving so many dangerous missions. He was shot down over 30 times, wounded multiple times, and lost his right leg below the knee in 1945, but continued flying even after this injury. After the war, he wrote memoirs, remained unrepentant about his service to Nazi Germany, and became a controversial figure due to his continued allegiance to Nazi ideology. The tactical and technical lessons from the sinking of the Marat were studied intensively by all major powers. The Germans continued to develop specialized anti-ship weapons, including guided bombs and missiles that would be used with some success later in the war. The Japanese, who had their own highly effective dive bombers and torpedo bombers, incorporated lessons about attacking heavily defended harbors and about using armor-piercing bombs against capital ships, lessons that would be applied at Pearl Harbor just 6 weeks after the Marat was sunk. The Americans and British developed increasingly heavy bombs and increasingly sophisticated delivery systems to attack hardened targets, including ships, fortifications, and later German U-boat pens. The sinking of the Marat also had propaganda value for both sides. The Germans publicized it as an example of Luftwaffe effectiveness, and as proof that even Soviet capital ships were vulnerable to German air power. Rudel was decorated and promoted, and the attack was featured in German newsreels and publications. The Soviets, while acknowledging the ship had been damaged, downplayed the extent of the damage and emphasized that the ship continued to serve, that Soviet sailors fought heroically, and that German claims of a complete sinking were exaggerated. Both sides used the incident to serve their narratives about the course of the war and the effectiveness of their forces. In the broader context of World War II naval warfare, the sinking of the Marat was one of several incidents that collectively demonstrated that the era of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was ending. Pearl Harbor, where Japanese aircraft sank or damaged 8 American battleships, occurred just weeks after the Marat was sunk. The sinking of the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse by Japanese land-based torpedo bombers in December 1941 further reinforced the lesson. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, decided entirely by carrier aircraft with opposing surface fleets never coming within sight of each other, made clear that carriers had replaced battleships as the capital ships of modern navies. By the end of the war, battleships were still formidable weapons and still served valuable roles, but they were no longer the dominant force in naval warfare. Aircraft, whether land-based or carrier-based, had proven themselves capable of destroying even the largest warships, and naval strategy had to adapt to this new reality. The Ju-87 Stuka, the aircraft that made possible the sinking of the Marat, was itself obsolete by war's end, too slow and vulnerable to survive in airspace dominated by modern fighters. Yet in the hands of a skilled pilot like Rudel, carrying the right weapon and attacking the right target under the right circumstances, this obsolete aircraft achieved one of the most remarkable single-mission successes in the history of air-sea warfare. The image of a single dive bomber destroying a 23,000-ton battleship with a single bomb captured imaginations and symbolized the revolution in warfare that air power represented. On October 23, 1941, over Kronstadt harbor, the future of naval warfare arrived in the form of a screaming Stuka carrying a 2,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, and when that bomb detonated in the Marat's forward magazine, it did more than destroy a single ship. It demonstrated conclusively that the age of the battleship was ending, and that air power would dominate warfare for generations to come.